was a man. His shadow was burned into the stone by the heat ray of the atomic bomb on August the 6th, 1945. This is the city as it was then. Has the memory of the devastation, like that shadow, faded? It's a long time ago now, and life must go on. Is all well? No, by no means. Hiroshima Hospital today. A man has just died of leukemia, the dreaded disease. Mr. Hamoshiro came to Hiroshima 1 week after the atomic explosion to buy a horse. He stayed 2 days. He had to sleep in the streets. Now, sudden disease. He has just died. His death is a great shock to the other atomic victims. Already 20 other patients have died this year. Mr. Hamoshiro was only 30. He had suffered from acute leukemia since the autumn. Continuous bleeding from his gums and nostrils finally resulted in death. His body is brought home. His mother, his family and friends mourn. Time cannot avert their tragedy. The news of his sudden death spreads panic through the city. Here are more victims of the atomic bombing. Doctors say that it is almost always impossible to expect a recovery from leukemia. They use drugs and blood transfusions, but these only ease. They cannot cure. Leukemia, which is a form of cancer of the blood, may take years to develop. The average period between exposure to the atomic explosions and the appearance of first symptoms was 6 years. Before the bombs dropped, the proportion of abnormal children to those born healthy was very low. But in the years since that day, this proportion has changed enormously. This boy was orphaned in Nagasaki, but he was fortunate enough to have his grandmother to look after him. Not all orphans are so lucky. Then, recently, a school medical examination revealed leukemia. The doctor, examining a sample of his blood, finds that the number of red corpuscles is just half that of healthy blood. The case is hopeless. But the boy thinks he will go back to school soon. This girl is 14. She has spent 10 years in bed, suffering from suppuration of the heart caused by radioactivity. It is possible that an operation could save her, but she is not strong enough for that. By day, her mother works in the fields. At night, she prays with her daughter. God may hear her prayers, but what of the world? These we have seen are but a few of the many atomic victims in hospital awaiting death. But to die is not the worst tragedy. It is sometimes harder to live for the victims who, because of their disfigurement, are outcasts among their own people. Here is a girl who is still able to go about her daily life. Her mother, who rescued her at the time of the explosion, has 3 times helped her to pay for plastic surgery, but her face and body are still cramped and disfigured. So many suffered such disfigurement. Plastic surgery being of no avail, her mother hides as much as possible of her ugly scars before she goes to work each morning. There are very few jobs open to such people, but some of the badly disfigured find consolation in working with the blind, who cannot see their scars. disfigured nurses work at the Hiroshima Blind Orphans' Home. This one had almost given up all hope, but now she works among young people whose parents have died since the atomic bombing. She helps a blind boy with his drawings. There is a great bond between the nurse and her charges. Some of these children were born blind, and some of the older ones were blinded by the flash on that day. The adult victims were almost completely ostracized by the rest of the community, which dreaded their disfigurement. In their loneliness, they formed clubs and centers of their own. A society for atomic victims sprang up. Because of their ugly skins, they are not permitted to use the public baths, but here they have a bathhouse of their own. Here, they can enjoy life again together. But others, in their loneliness and despair, contemplate suicide. Meet Mr. Fukada. He was in business in Shanghai, but just before the atomic explosion, he returned home. He contracted leukemia, but blood transfusions from his wife and children have in part relieved his pain. He cannot support his family. They must support him and pay his hospital bills. They live in poverty on the outskirts of the city, without electricity, with very little food, and no social security. Many hundreds in similar circumstances have already been driven to suicide because they found it too hard to live. Every Saturday, the children walk halfway to hospital to save bus fares. The family look forward to their weekend reunions. A hospital worker, Miss Yamaguchi, herself an atomic victim, brings extra food for the children. In his despair, Mr. Fukada had planned to kill his family and commit suicide himself, as countless others have already done. But Miss Yamaguchi has told him of the growing national movement, of the aid and relief which must surely come, and implored him not to despair. Their mutual suffering gives mutual strength. On Saturdays, the children stay overnight. They sleep soundly. Their father, not at all. The Fukada children are lucky. Their parents are still alive. But during the war, many young children were evacuated from the towns only to return at the end of the war orphans. Their photographs of their parents are their most treasured possessions. This is one of the orphanages set up for the children whose parents have died as a result of the atomic explosions in 1945. These orphans are not ambitious as ordinary youngsters are. They live much more isolated lives. Although their bodies are healthy, their spirits are sick. But gradually, they are being rehabilitated and trained for jobs. They are learning that it is still good to live.
This mother, in spite of the opposition of her relatives and friends, was determined that the rest of the world should not remain unaware of her daughter's disfigurement, and broke through the traditional Japanese reserve. She sent a wax model of her daughter's hand to the atomic bomb commemoration hall in Hiroshima for all people to see. She hoped that in so doing, they would be moved to join the international campaign against nuclear weapons and tests. Her hope is being rewarded.
Her hope is being rewarded, yes. But the tests go on. From the beautiful Japanese countryside, we go now to the streets of Hiroshima. In the normal rush of city life, it might be imagined that the tragedy is forgotten, but that is not so. The sudden sight of scarred faces is a constant reminder. And it was here that in 1955, the first World Conference against atomic and hydrogen bombs was held. Miss Yamaguchi, friend of Mr. Fukada and spokesman for all the victims of Nagasaki, is preparing to attend the conference. It was attended by 52 delegates from 14 different countries and by 3,000 Japanese delegates, together with the victims from Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and Bikini. Miss Yamaguchi made this speech.
When the atom bomb dropped on Nagasaki, I was 15 years old. It made my face as you see it now. I was 7 months in hospital. When I came out, there was nowhere to go. My family was dead, but for one brother, I was alone. You might think I should be bitter. I could curse, but I do not. I ask only that you make sure this terrible thing will never happen again. If no other raise their voices, we, the victims, must. Please, please, never again allow them to use so terrible a weapon on this earth.
Her speech, with the speeches of countless others at that 3-day conference, produced a tremendous effect. Miss Yamaguchi returned to her hospital work, stronger in the knowledge that the nation had been roused to action. A national campaign for state aid to the victims and against nuclear weapons and atomic tests had begun. People were in the streets collecting signatures. The campaign was given even greater urgency by the test explosion of an atomic bomb which had taken place at Bikini Atoll. As a result of this, these fishermen, many miles out at sea, far from the explosion center, were covered in the fallout by the dust of death. Mr. Kuboyama was the first of them to die. The whole nation was stunned by the news of his death. His wife and mother mourned. Do not touch. This tuna fish is radioactive. Mr. Kuboyama's death had a tremendous impact upon the people of Japan, and the campaign went on with renewed vigor. 34 million signatures were collected, and a petition was presented to the United Nations, and a delegation was sent to their own government. Meet now Miss Watanabe of Nagasaki. When the bomb dropped in 1945, she was 16 years old. In the destruction of the factory she worked, her spinal cord was broken and her legs were completely crushed by the machinery. She spent 4 months in hospital, but was finally discharged as incurable. She was sent home. From that day until now, she has not been out of the house. She has not seen her city. She has been completely isolated. She works through the day partly on her knitting machine and partly sewing in 3-hourly shifts. Her mother repairs sandals, and together they work to earn enough money to keep her surviving son at university. Her eldest son and her husband were both killed during the war. Miss Watanabe's one wish was to see Nagasaki again. The filmmakers approached the city council, and her wish was realized. After so long, she hardly recognizes any of it. At the explosion center stands this memorial. She sees the new Peace Park and a statue dedicated to peace. The factory at which she worked has been rebuilt now. This is as she remembers it on that day. She sees the place where her brother was killed. That is the spot where his body was recovered 2 months later.
There is no social security for us victims, and yet warships are being made. I cannot understand it.
She meets a member of the Society for Young Atomic Victims, who was a delegate to Tokyo when the national petition was presented to the government. He tells her that at last their government is being persuaded to help the victims and to join the international campaign against atomic weapons and tests. This was the first time in the history of Japan that such a people's delegation had been received by their government. The people who worked on this film, the people of Japan who are in this film, do not want either your pity or your sympathy. They want only your action.